Well, everybody, welcome back to the UNM Department of Anthropology Colloquium Series. I'm very excited for today's speaker, as are many of you I know. First, I want to acknowledge that UNM is located on the traditional land of the Pueblo of Sandia. The land holds deep historical, spiritual, and personal significance for New Mexico's indigenous peoples. We acknowledge their connection to the land, and we're very grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and learn here. So I'm very excited, like I said, to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Joseph Aguilar is an enrolled member of the San Ildefonso Pueblo here in New Mexico, not far from Santa Fe, and currently serves as an archaeologist with the Bering Straits Native Corporation and is also the Pueblo's Deputy Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. Dr. Aguilar received his undergraduate degree from the University of New Mexico. We're very proud of that. And he received his Ph.D. from the Department of Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. His general research interests include indigenous archaeology, museums, landscape archaeology, and tribal historic preservation. He is currently working on exhibit and content development for a number of museums, including the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture in Santa Fe, the Chapin Mesa Archaeological Museum at Mesa Verde National Park, and the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe. And recently, Dr. Aguilar became an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology here at UNM. So we're very happy to have them as part of our faculty. The title of his talk today is Indigenizing the Academies, Asserting Indigenous Thought and Practice in Archaeology and Museums. Thank you very much for being willing to speak this afternoon. Again, we're all looking very forward to it. Welcome.
Thank you for that introduction, Ian. It's nice to be talking to everybody on a nice Friday afternoon. Hopefully I won't keep you guys too long so you can get your weekend started and enjoy the nice weather that we're having. As Ian mentioned in his introduction, my name is Joseph Aguilar from San Ildefonso Pueblo. I have a long history with UNM. Graduated undergrad way back in 2006. Geez, that's such a long time ago. So I've been doing archaeology basically since I first started taking my undergraduate classes there. So it's nice to be talking to the university, the department. I did just come on as adjunct professor, which I think is a big difference from just being a regular old professor. I'm still trying to figure out what my role is in the department with that title, but I'm sure we'll figure it out. I'd like to give back to the department that's given so much to me over the years. But today I want to talk about museums and how indigenous people, scholars, communities, how we're all kind of working kind of at a nexus really of history, anthropology, and archaeology. Doing archaeology for as long as I've been doing it, I've come to notice that some archaeologists, not all, and the discipline at large, don't really talk about museum collections outside of how they're useful to kind of research questions. And I see some people not really giving much consideration to kind of the provenance or the histories of the collections that they use. So I'd like to talk about some ways today by which some museum folks are beginning to integrate indigenous communities and their intellects into the collections, and some representations like through exhibits and other ways, how they're engaging with Native communities to better understand museum collections and create exhibits and spaces that acknowledge and integrate indigenous intellect in ways that go beyond kind of standard museum practices. So I'll do that by highlighting a few projects that I'm involved in that I've been involved in lately with museums. So as with many indigenous cultures across North America, Pueblo communities in particular have been speculated upon by anthropologists and archaeologists. And as a result, Pueblo intellect and material culture were heavily collected and extracted from our communities, especially around the turn of the 20th century. And a residual effect of these practices are the vast amounts of Pueblo intellectual property and material culture dispersed in museums and private collections to this day. Museums and other collecting institutions as repositories of these materials represent and perpetuate this legacy. Fortunately, these materials have gained a great interest amongst Pueblo people today, myself included. And we're seeking ways to engage and be inspired by these collections. Pueblo historical consciousness is as vibrant as ever, and the partnerships that museums are creating with Native communities taps into a wealth of knowledge and understanding about collections that is as robust as it is diverse. Historically, the tangible and intangible responsibilities and stewardship of museum collections have primarily been the responsibility of institutions rather than indigenous people or communities themselves. The thoughtful integration of indigenous scholarship and intellect, as seen in the examples that I'll provide today, serves as an intervention of sorts in assisting the expansion and improvement of the understanding of the stewardship of collections and the overall relationships between Native communities and these institutions. As these institutions begin to open their collections and ideologies to include Native peoples, a more informed and responsible study and representation of Native American art and material culture can emerge. Museums, anthropologists, art collectors have learned and benefited tremendously from the collection of Native American material and culture over time. And if Native American communities are to benefit from these collections, perhaps not in the same manner, but to the same degree, communities must begin to lead the way towards change in concerning the accession, dissemination, and representation of our cultural patrimony. Public communities historically have not been included in the overall management regarding the cultural patrimony held outside of our communities. Given that the dissemination of public cultural patrimony has occurred in institutions and private collections across the US and the world, there's a little bit of a logistical problem in kind of asserting our involvement in these collections. But by creating models with culturally appropriate methodologies for engaging with the enormous amount of our cultural patrimony across the world, we can begin to assert ourselves and our way of thinking in the processes of museums and other institutions. Because the routine practices of museums tend to be void of any indigenous voices, indigenous partnerships are needed to address the specific interests of Native communities. So indigenous peoples' histories, lived experiences are only partially manifest in the material culture housed in institutions. So these are the purview of scholars and collectors. And there's been an over-reliance on institutions that institutions have had on often incomplete or limited forms of material culture and information related to them. So there's been a big gap in kind of the breadth of the knowledge or the creation of knowledge relating to cultures, indigenous cultures. So the projects that I want to talk about today are important demonstrations of how to re-engage public communities together with our own cultural patrimony. These projects are critical exercises in moving towards the goal of sustainably merging Indigenous intellect with museum collections, with the exercise of these projects determining the directions of museums and collections management. While the collections and community voices represented here have the geographic roots in the North American Southwest, there's a potential for these projects to have an influence on the development of the indigenized methodologies and practice by museums, museum anthropologists, and art collectors. So these projects aim to not only represent beautiful examples of material culture, and you'll see often these exhibits highlight very beautiful examples of Pueblo material culture. But the bigger goal is to educate museums, anthropologists, collectors, and Native communities, our own Native communities, about the highly contextual and culturally specific nature of museum collections, which in turn can help inform the stewardship and care of those collections through culturally appropriate methodologies and practices. So, how then can Indigenous people or Pueblo people assert our intellect into the collections? Pueblo communities must take a proactive role in the dissemination of our cultural patrimony and intellectual property by transcending the often bureaucratic modes of interaction. For example, consultation, sometimes static form of communication. We need to create physical and intellectual spheres that allow for heightened levels of interaction that go beyond consultation. Intellectual spaces created in this fashion exhibit an appreciation of the power relations that govern the flow of ideas and challenge the underlying colonial frameworks that continue to deeply influence cultural institutions to this day. So the projects I'll talk about here briefly aim to work within a framework that acknowledges the value of Indigenous intellect and the importance of its incorporation into the discourse of Indigenous material culture. In this way, these and other projects are helping to grow the intellectual potential and value of their collections through the application of Indigenous knowledges. And each of these institutions are uniquely situated within a disciplinary legacy that is inextricably tied to Pueblo communities. I mean, their histories are deeply woven together. And having this situational awareness allows for a careful consideration of how to redress past institutional practices and open up new intellectual spheres. So that's kind of the background of my thinking of how we can begin to acknowledge and integrate Indigenous intellect into collections, into museum collections. And speaking as a Pueblo person, I can speak from my own background and upbringing as a Pueblo person, and how Pueblo knowledge specifically can benefit how museums represent Indigenous cultures. So I'll now begin to talk about some of the museum projects that I'm involved in. These projects are challenging traditional modes of connoisseurship, museum thinking, curatorship, and representation. So over the past, it's been 2-3 years, COVID years seem so much longer. I've been working with several local and regional museums in building or creating brand new or redone exhibit spaces, or specific museum exhibits. So the first one of these exhibits that I'll talk about is my work at the Chapin Mesa Archaeological Museum at Mesa Verde National Park. I've been involved with this project, wow, since 2019. And we've been working through COVID, through the pandemic, to kind of hammer out the redesign of this, I think it's 95-year-old museum at Mesa Verde. I'm sure lots of you have been to that museum, and those exhibits are just from a whole nother time completely. So it was time to kind of redo that whole museum from scratch, basically. What's cool about this project is that it's a collaborative project between the National Park Service and the University of Colorado Museum of Natural History. They entered into a collaborative relationship in 2018 for the purposes of redesigning the museum. Those institutions have partnered with the 26 affiliated tribes associated with Mesa Verde. And we began the project with a series of in-person meetings before COVID, of course. Some of these events were held in Cortez, Colorado, Albuquerque, Boulder, and in Durango at Fort Lewis College. These meetings were meant to explore the ideas and topics from the discipline of Southwest archaeology that are relevant to the project. Holding these events on college campuses also made it possible for students to attend, an important aspect to this project as a whole. There was some public programming that was held at these places, and there was some invitation-only workshops that were held in association with these public events. The goals of the public programs were to inform the larger community, including students, about the project, and to engage the community in a discussion of issues related to Southwest archaeology. And the goal of the workshops was to engage Southwest archaeologists working in the Mesa Verde region in discussions about relevant archaeology content and important issues for the renovated exhibits. So the reimagining of the museum at Mesa Verde is a case which speaks again to the culturally particular nature of Indigenous and collaborative archaeology, and represents a methodological and theoretical commitment to the reintegration of archaeological materials and contemporary Indigenous peoples. So one of the very first meetings that was held with tribal members, descendant community members, was in January of 2020. Again, that just seems like so long ago. Here's a group photo of us meeting at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center in Santa Fe. Actually, this was, yeah, January of 2020, I'm sorry. Of the 26 associated tribes, individuals from 15 tribes, including from 8 pueblos, the Ute, Apache, and Navajo nations, attended the meeting. And the goals of the meeting were to review and revise the collaborative process, brainstorm potential content areas, and determine a smaller working group to guide content decisions for the duration of the exhibit development process. So of this large group here, we've kind of settled on a group of about 8 participants from tribal communities to serve as what's become known as the Tribal Content Development Group. And like I've mentioned throughout this presentation, The COVID-19 pandemic has made this work much more difficult than it normally would be. A lot of these discussions are these really deep discussions on collaboration, partnership, how to integrate Indigenous intellect into the process. Were really hard to do over a virtual setting. So we were fortunate to have at least a couple meetings in person, but we've done the best we could over Zoom to kind of keep the momentum, I guess, of this project going. And I'm sure we've all experienced kind of what's it called, Zoom fatigue, and we got to a state where we were really just kind of cruising and got a little staticky. So it's been a challenge to find new ways to keep the momentum of our early discussions going, but we've managed to have a number of discussions over Zoom with the Tribal Content Development Working Group. And what's resulted is this really kind of rich tapestry of Indigenous thought and intellect that has guided the kind of methods and practice of redesigning a really important museum in the Southwest. So what I'll share next is a drawing of some really innovative note-taking by a firm who does this type of work. It's called Take Action. So to see our notes kind of illustrated in this way as a result of one of our meetings, it's just it really kind of helps put the larger discussion into perspective. And we have this type of note taking for several of our meetings, but this is just to provide you a kind of example of the types of discussions that we've had amongst the groups that are involved in this museum redesign. So you can see it's just a brainstorm of ideas that include kind of larger or broad themes and kind of smaller subsets of these big ideas and down to the very details. So you can see amongst this discussion or these notes are that there's really a lot of Indigenous kind of values and perspectives that are a large part of this, such as the inclusion of Native voices, the multiplicity of stories, and so many others that are really kind of integrated into this kind of way of organizing our thoughts. And so where we're at now with this project, we had intended to meet in person because things were looking a little bit better with COVID back over the summer. Unfortunately, things have kind of taken a left turn with the pandemic, and so we've delayed an in-person meeting in October to a virtual one. But all this is to say that to properly and appropriately redo a museum like the Chapin Mesa Archaeological Museum, we've had like seriously 3+ years of discussions just to get to the big broad outlines of what types of content we'd like in the museums. And many of those, if not all of those discussions, included integrating Indigenous intellect into the collection. And it's really kind of transformed what collaboration looks like. And so hopefully the results of these discussions and resulting outcome, a redesigned museum, will kind of inform future museum projects. So I look forward, and you guys can look forward to seeing something vastly different at the the Chapin Mesa Archaeology Museum. Another project that I'm involved in is is at the Young Art Museum in San Francisco. It's called the Thomas Weissel Family Collection at the Young Museum. What we're doing at the Young is creating an exhibit and a catalog that revolves around a collection donated by Thomas Weissel. It's really an anthology of Native American art assembled over 3 decades by Mr. Weissel. He was kind of a tech pioneer in Silicon Valley and a noted collector of Native American art. The collection includes approximately 200 objects and spans nearly 1,000 years of artistic production. Some of the Pueblo material in this collection includes 11th century memory ceramics to 19th century baskets and pots by recognized artists such as the 𝗭cie𝗹𝗹𝗆 artist 𝗦𝗲𝗿𝗶𝗲𝗆. Other objects include Navajo weaving and other ancestral pottery. And so for this project, we wanted to investigate pottery beyond its aesthetic presence and begin to articulate the Pueblo meaning in which they were made and the worldview that informs them as read through materials, shapes, and designs. We were invited by the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco to help them understand these origins and continuing stories. And we believe that any work on this pottery must begin with a Pueblo understanding and conversation about ancestral pottery rather than debating epistemologies and or property rights. And unfortunately, a lot of these discussions happened over Zoom with our group of tribal advisors. The Young reached out early to public communities at the onset of the project to form a partnership that would allow for the appropriate discussions to take place regarding the exhibition. And some of the folks who ended up being a part of this tribal advisory group include folks from 𝗭ci:h Pueblo, 𝗭cie, 𝗁i𝗍, 𝗂ci:h, and myself from San Ildefonso Pueblo. And really at the foundation of this group and our partnership with the museum, with the Young Museum, was openness, integrity, honesty, and generosity. Those concepts really permeated our conversations and our resulting decisions about which pots to illustrate and which to use for future exhibitions. Most significantly, different levels of cultural sensitivity were discussed for different pots. Conversations that really cut to the core and corrected non-Pueblo people's generalities about excavated burials and other places. So the nuances of understanding these materials can only come from the proper Pueblo partners. And so the results of this dialogue will be captured in the exhibit and the catalog in writing, including a culturally sensitive approach to reproducing ancestral pottery images. This includes obscured images or grayed out images that were deliberately created in that fashion for particularly sensitive pieces. So every pot was individually considered. There was like really deep discussions on each of the individual pieces of the collections. And most of these pots generated really lively discussions, while others solicited respectful silence. Nonetheless, as of yet, there's no conclusive way to reconcile Pueblo and non-Pueblo ontologies. but at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, by respecting boundaries and building trust, an environment has been created for a dialogue to this end. And hearing about the distinctive differences of worldviews, sometimes irreconcilable, it's really a pleasure of the consultation process and an opportunity to learn from one another. And so we're still deeply involved in this project. It's probably going to be another year or so before this exhibit comes to fruition. But just as with the Mesa Verde Museum project, things move deliberately at the appropriate pace. I don't want to say slow because that's not the appropriate word to use. They move, the discussions move at the pace that they need to move. And what results in the end is a more kind of enriched and nuanced understanding of this collection in particular. So another project to look forward to in the pipeline. Similar to this project is a project that I'm involved in with the School for Advanced Research and the 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗃 Foundation in New York City. They've partnered together to develop an exhibit focused on Pueblo pottery entitled Grounded in Clay, Voices from Pueblo Country. And it's designed to be a community-based traveling exhibit developed to showcase the deep history and beauty of Pueblo pottery while bringing to life the complex narratives and stories of this essential art form. So this particular collaborative exhibit is focused solely on pottery, really the most abundant material culture, in my view, of ancestral Pueblo peoples. It's the most resilient, and often as a result, it's the most studied, and people expect pottery to tell us a lot of things. And I contributed a essay on one piece of ancestral pottery for this catalog, in which I kind of wrote about this burden, in which I call it, that pottery has. It's expected to do so much in its life as a vessel for carrying water or feeding people. And even after its use in that manner, if it's broken, found in pieces, it's still expected to tell a lot about a people. And so I see that a huge burden on pottery. And so what the approach that I think SAR and the 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗃 Foundation are taking is kind of take some of that burden off the material culture and allow Pueblo people to insert or assert their kind of perspectives and voices on what these materials mean to them, whether that's on a personal level or a community level. So what's resulted is a really kind of rich expression by ancestral Pueblo, by descendant communities on the meanings and kind of deeper understandings of what Pueblo pottery is, what it could be. So there's been involvement from, I think, nearly every Pueblo community in this project. Most folks are contributing captions to certain individual pieces within the collections that spoke to them in some way or that they wanted to explore more. And these captions or these kind of expressions, these written expressions within the catalog don't take on standard or traditional forms. There's many artistic kind of expressions on what pottery means to people. Some are more scholarly, some are personal, some come from a kind of community perspective. But what's really neat about this project is kind of the freedom of expression. And what really shines as a result is the kind of diversity of the Pueblo intellect that resides within Pueblo communities as it relates to pottery specifically. So like with all these other projects that I've been talking about, the pandemic has certainly made it much more difficult to engage with each other and to engage with the collection. But SAR and 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 have found ways to accommodate folks in wanting to kind of personally engage with the collections. You know, I've made an appointment to go see some of the collections and draw inspirations for some of my own writing in the catalog, which includes a larger essay on the overall project itself. So again, another kind of really cool, really important partnership that will result in a really kind of groundbreaking exhibit. And so in the next year or so, the project is expected to open up. I think one of the first places it's going to open up is at the, I think the first place it's going to open up is at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture in Santa Fe. And the idea is that this exhibit will travel to other museums, regionally, nationally, and perhaps internationally. So they've got big plans for this project, and it's really cool just to see through the traveling aspect of it, to see the dissemination of Native intellect kind of reach a larger audience. And in the picture there is a piece of 𝗭𝗏𝗶𝗂𝗆𝗆 from the late 1690s or so that I chose to write on because it's near and dear to my own community as a 𝗭𝗏 person, and the time period that I'm interested in as an archaeologist, the Pueblo Revolt era. And so it's just really cool to be able to express myself in different ways within this project. And I think that's the real value of this. There's, I think, over 60 different community member contributions to the catalog. And like I said, they all take on different forms. Some of these include even poetry and other kind of artistic expressions. So look forward to this exhibit in the very near future. One of the last museum projects that I'll talk about is something that's probably the most challenging of any museum project that I've ever been involved in. And this is the development of my own community here at San Ildefonso Pueblo, my own community's museum and or cultural center. And I hate to use those terms because I don't like the idea of being kind of hooked on kind of a Western idea of what these places should be. So I see the terms museum, cultural center as a placeholder of sorts. So we've been playing with the idea here in our Pueblo for a long time about a creation of a space like this to represent our culture, not only to the outside world, but as a place to kind of perpetuate and appreciate our Pueblo culture as a community. And so all of this has really made myself and my community rethink museums and these types of spaces, not in a traditional manner, but something that connects the inside of a community with the outside. something that connects the nature of people's view of the world that is not Western and traditional, something that pushes people away from colonized or Western idea of a museum, which is fashion in that way are really places that control space, cultural material, artifacts, art, the story, and the people into a box created by outsiders. So museums fashion that way, they look nice, but they don't really reflect kind of the heart of Pueblo people. So as with the other projects, we've been involved in just really deep, nuanced discussions about what this place means to our community. You know, there's some folks within my community have a certain expectations of what a museum should be. 4 walls with glass cases and exhibits, an archive and maybe collections. That's because don't really know anything else, because that's the way museums have been presented to us. So what we're doing as a community is kind of really challenging the idea of what a museum is, challenging the monopoly that museums have had over the representation, stewardship of Pueblo material culture and intellect, and creating something from the ground up that really is reflective of who we are as a people. What makes us uniquely San Ildefonso people. And we're drawing inspiration from other tribal cultural centers, such as 𝗭𝐞𝐻 Pueblo, who have a really awesome museum and cultural center. The 𝗭 Museum in 𝗭𝗏𝗄𝐻 Pueblo, who've really created a space based on their own values and identity for their community. So we're really moving these conversations we're really drawing inspiration from these examples into how we can create a place that's uniquely ours and that uniquely represents us. Whereas, you know, the other projects I'm working on, they're kind of working around that through kind of already established institutions and kind of ways of doing things, where in those projects, communities are coming in, challenging the way those institutions operate. But here in my Pueblo, we're really just kind of throwing everything we know about museums out the door and creating something really new that's challenging, I think, the way museums and anthropology to some extent really think about Pueblo people. So I know that was a pretty exhaustive explanation or dive into some of the projects I'm involved in and the background of my thinking into museums. Again, museums are only something I've only become involved in the past few years, but I'm really taking a deep dive because trained as an archaeologist doing archaeology things, if you will. There's always been, to me, a disconnect between the discipline of archaeology and museums. And I wanted to find a way as an archaeologist to kind of to merge those academies, if you will. And I think I'm trying to do that by being involved in these different projects and by bringing community people into these projects. So I appreciate your time, and I'm willing to take any questions. I've got all afternoon if anybody has anything to comment on or ask me about. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really wonderful. It was very thought-provoking. Yes, please, anybody who has questions, please just turn on your camera and feel free to ask them. Carla, go ahead.
Well, mostly I want to really thank you for that talk, Woody, and hope we can invite you to join the process that the Maxwell Museum is launching as in the very near future to reimagine our exhibits and curation practices and museum work in the ways that you were talking about as part of a very deep engagement with Pueblo and other Indigenous communities. I loved your comment on the pace, that work takes the pace it needs to take, and thought of a former colleague, Ray Silverman, who actually used the phrase slow museology, not in the way that you talked about slow as pejorative, but in the way that the slow food movement is a movement to give food the attention and care it needs to produce the best outcome. So I don't really have a question for you, but more of an invitation to say, we hope that you will join us in our efforts as they move forward, and we'll be in touch.
Sounds good. Thanks for the comments. Yeah, I really do feel that these projects or museums, as they work with tribes, should try not to rush things or conform to any kind of preconceived notions of how museums should function when they partner with tribes, and just let it kind of go with the flow.
Hi, Joe. I really liked your talk. I was wondering, as non-Indigenous academics, what do you see as the best things that we can sort of do to support or facilitate or advocate for the endeavors like what you were just talking about?
That's the big question, right? I think really the best things that non-Indigenous folks as yourself can do is one, listen. Just take the time to listen and acknowledge kind of different ways of doing things or different ways of understanding things. And I think one of the bigger things folks can do is question the histories of the institutions you work for. Question the provenance of collections, where they came from, their backgrounds. I began to do a lot of this on my own, on some of the collections locally, like in Santa Fe or other places. And I found out that these collections really have sordid histories, as they relate to my own community. And it was really disturbing. And if my own community members really understood the breadth of early kind of archaeology practices or anthropology practices, how extractive they were, and how there was little benefit to our own communities, we'd all be pretty disturbed. And these collections, for me, they're still in existence out there, and they represent that early legacy. So I guess there's kind of a truth telling of sorts to be done. I think those are kind of the ways you can engage better, listen, and question.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Hmm?
Yeah, Loa, you want to go ahead? Okay.
Yeah, Woody, thank you. Joseph, thank you so much for your presentation. It's such an exciting range of projects that you're involved in. And I was so glad that you wrapped up with the work that you're involved in your home community. And it's really exciting to see. And I wondered if you can share a little bit of how within your working group there at San Ildefonso for your own Pueblo Center, how how you're talking through the tension of a community center serving the community from an internal and very internally oriented perspective, and how also the group sees the challenge or the both the opportunities as well as kind of the burden of addressing how it serves those outside the community. Because I think that's a really not straightforward thing. And I'm just really intrigued to hear your perspectives on that tension.
Yeah, it's not really, yeah, like you said, it's not a straightforward kind of answer to that question. So one of the biggest questions we pose to ourselves is like, who is this place for? Is it for us as a community, or is it for outsiders? Is it for both? Like, how do you reconcile that, or how do you manage that? And so we've had long conversations about this, like what it means for this space to be solely for us and for outsiders. Even the location of it, determines one of the answers to that, like an answer to that question. Like if it's located within the community, does that make it more ours? If it's located outside the community, like say near a highway or a corridor where people are traveling, does that make it more for outsiders? And in my view, this place is not a replacement for perpetuating cultural or our culture or our way of life. It could be a place where we could maybe learn things in different settings, but we have a way traditionally of perpetuating our culture through, I don't know, so many different traditions and ways of doing things, that unless they're conducted in the proper setting, it just doesn't make it appropriate. So these are the conversations we're having right now, Loa, and it's really cool just to hear different community perspectives on what this place means for both community members and for outsiders who want to learn more about our community. So stay tuned. Maybe we'll have some kind of resolution to that conundrum.
Well, thank you. I'm really looking forward to all these projects coming to fruition. It's just really, really exciting work. Thanks for bringing it to us.
David, go ahead.
Thanks. I'm Dave Grenfelt. I'm the speaker next Friday on water ethics. And I want to ask a question about water ethics and museums, because in the water field, from the side of UNESCO, the UN agency, there's a real interest in water museums as a way of opening up the conversation about what are rivers for, rights of nature, cultural rights to have a relationship with the ancestral river. And I think that from a water ethics perspective, which I'll talk about next week, to understand what's ethical and what's not ethical about a given water body, you really need to know the history of it. And one of the advantages of a museum approach to a river like the Rio Grande is that you have to start at the beginning, and you automatically bring in a focus on indigenous uses and understandings and relationships of that body of water. And it's kind of, I know that there are a number of indigenous leaders who are involved in the UNESCO initiative of developing water museums, but I was just wondering if that's come up in your own kind of brainstorming about content for the museums, and whether you've given any thought to a Rio Grande museum, either at the Pueblo level or at the cross Pueblo level, the all Pueblo Council level, or just a way of engaging with the non-Indigenous world about the future of the Rio Grande. and how the worldviews are so distinct, but there's also an unusual opportunity to engage in, cross-cultural dialogue about natural resources. So I'll leave it at that, but maybe we can talk offline about the idea. Thanks.
Sure. I mean, that's really thought-provoking. As it relates to the San Museum and Cultural Center, we haven't even gotten to specific content areas yet. But as we've found out in our discussions at Mesa Verde, natural resources, including water, was a huge part of our discussions as it relates to creating content for the museum. The tribal content development group didn't want to focus on just cultural materials, but all the things that occur naturally at a place like Mesa Verde. And this included things like plants, animals, and water, to be sure. So it really is thought-provoking, and this is something that I'd like to chat more with you about in private.
Let's do it. Thanks.
Sure.
Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Well, I just wanted to say, this is more of a comment. You talked about the burden that is placed on ceramics and other artifacts that are in museums, and I feel like that is a very profound insight, and and it's one that I need to think more about. And I think that you've identified something that's really important, and also sort of what our responsibility is as people who are interested not just in things but in peoples and life and not relying on these things to be the only way in which we sort of understand the world and peoples and stuff like that. Anyway, I need to think more about it, but I just wanted to sort of compliment you on what I think is actually a pretty deep insight. Yeah. So.
I just want to say something. I'm Louise Lamphear, and I happen to be on the board of the SAR. So I was really pleased to hear a little bit more about the 𝗏𝗏𝗃 exhibit, because we talk about it, but exactly what's going on inside of it is terrific. And the other thing I'm really impressed with is how far these projects have gone from things like the big exhibit that the Met, like 2 years ago, that SAR was involved in, which had in some indigenous voices, but not nearly the kind of thing that these all of these projects are trying to do, which is to kind of create not just a different museum, but a way of thinking about and a way of presenting probably intellectual knowledge. And I think the vocabulary you use and how you talk about it is really indicative of how far things are going, and how much better we're all, the outsider's experience is going to be, through this, and also hopefully do a better job of actually, putting in Pueblo voices. That was just a comment.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, there's so many just really discussions and people listening. That's what, like, I've been involved in some of these projects, and it's just been years of talking and listening. Some of the maybe outsiders who we work with really wanted to dive in right away to like specific museum design and content, and we're like, we can't get there without understanding the deeper meanings of what this material means to us, and that really dictates what goes inside of a museum in our view. And what I've really learned about through these projects and through these processes is that like less is more for me when it comes to museums, for sure. You don't need 50 examples of one type of, say, like whiteware or projectile point to say something about that type of material culture. Because at that point, you're just kind of showing off what you have. And so I've really become an advocate of showing less or nothing at all, and just listening to what people have to say about those things.
Yeah.
Loa, did you have another?
I was going to ask a follow-up really to several comments that you've just shared, Joseph, because I'm interested how you see, looking a little bit farther down the road, how you see the variety, the range of community voices, and whether there's an interest in a completely different format of engaging with the non-native, world about this interest in not only your own motivations and concerns for representation and enriching community life from an internal perspective, but then how that can take shape and be driven by communities plural and the members thereof. Because obviously now we're a couple decades out from NMAI. We're 30 years out from NAGPRO. We're 30 years out from the NMAI Act. And what I really appreciate is how you have raised this really important issue of how even just the format, the container of museums, the traditions that go along with it are such a problematic channel or vehicle or mode of engagement with other traditions. And what I'm interested in asking in this meandering question here is, how do we get really beyond the very worn traditions of museum approaches, exhibition projects, these kind of collection-driven outreach projects, all the way to then the even more problematic things like the tradition of craft and artistic markets and all those formats that have been with us for generations that are really so out of step with what is building as an interest and ideas that are coming together from Indigenous people's communities about what really resonates and how to bring that forward, how that can be the primary way of engaging with other, whether cross-cultural communication or this self sense of community representation to the wider, ever more global world. That was a very long, meandering question, but I'm interested in how you see what's coming next.
Yeah, and I think this is all happening incrementally, in small little steps in individual projects. And it's going to take time for all of this to kind of coalesce until we see some kind of shining example of what this thing is that it could be. But I think we're getting there. I really do think we're getting there with this type of engagement. And I've taken a lot of cues from Richard Leventhal and his work in Central America and the idea of like a non-museum, and with his work with Indigenous communities down there. Those are some of the ideas that I'm kind of trying to get our community members to really think deeply about, is like, what does representation mean to us? Or like, what does, how do we portray ourselves to the outside world that's not within this mold that you're talking about, Loa, of a museum with 4 walls and exhibits and this kind of standard of representation. I mean, for better or worse, it's what we're kind of stuck with in a lot of places. I don't see a lot of these museums busting down their walls, to create something revolutionary overnight, at least. But I think it just begins by these kind of small incremental changes. And you're right, we've had these like big benchmarks like NAGPRA and NMAI that, you know, we thought would like solve all the problems we have in these places, but they've just really made me, at least, question the kind of the institution and the idea of like museums even more. And I think to go forward, I think I'll probably just have more questions than I will have more solutions. But I think the challenge for me, I mean, the fun part of all this and the challenge for me is like working through all these problems, so that maybe somebody else smarter than me down the line can take them up.
Great work. Thanks so much. It's just great to hear all your ideas.
Are there any other questions or comments? Well, if not, please join me in thanking Joseph one more time. This was a really wonderful talk, and we're very happy to have you here as a part of our crew at UNM. So thanks very much. All right, everybody, have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, everybody, and look forward to seeing some of you soon, hopefully.
Yay, great job.
Bye.